Well, welcome everyone to episode 4 of Canon Fodder.
And hopefully the audience hasn't lost track. Episode 4 is about book 5.
Well, I think Rob or Fat Conan or Fat Yoshi or Bucklander has an issue that he would like to address as a preamble.
So I wanted to talk today because I've been doing some extra work, and there's a name that comes up quite commonly in 20th century classics work. And he's all over the Iliad and the Odyssey, and his name is Robert Graves. And very often Robert Graves will be a lot of people's first point of contact with classics nowadays. Laurentian, I know you looked through his book. What was the Trojan War? What was it called?
The Siege and Fall of Troy by Robert Graves.
Why Laurentian? You sound remarkably different. And Robert Graves is an excellent scholar. You know, you can't fault him for that. And who am I to question Robert Graves? One of the 20th century's most eminent poets as well. He was also a remarkably productive poet. And he knew just about every person in England worth knowing from about the end of the First World War to into the 60s. He served in the trenches. He served 5 years from 1914 to 1919. He left after 1919. I don't know why. Maybe he was in Russia. I'm not sure. I haven't read his biography, but he's written a number of remarkable sort of memoirs. Goodbye to all that. But Robert Graves is a problematic guy and the audience listening to this will certainly agree with me when I describe him as problematic. The people who think that the world is going along just fine if it wasn't for Donald Trump and Brexit, they will think that there's nothing wrong with Robert Graves. But I fully anticipate our guys, Canonites, to want to know if they come across Robert Graves if they're doing any extra reading about this, sort of what his background was. Now, he was, to put it mildly, he was unorthodox in his relationships. He was not biblical. I don't know how much I want to tiptoe around this, but
When you say relationships, you mean romantic endeavors?
Both romantic and legal. So he was known to be married to women. I expect today he might have been transsexual. I'm sure that there's critical theorists who would claim that someone like Robert Graves represents transsexuals lost to time. So, the sort of stuff about like history doesn't acknowledge the transsexual experience, but William Wallace was actually a transsexual because he wore a dress. Now, I'm very happy to call the Scots a bunch of women, but that's just a load of nonsense. So, but I expect Robert Graves would be called a sort of a hidden transsexual. He had relationships with men and women. He married women and didn't treat them particularly well. This is all tied up with, I think, his religious views. And Robert Graves, very roughly, this isn't to be super accurate about what Robert Graves thought or not, but more or less, very broad brushstrokes, Robert Graves thought that we were too masculine in our religion, and that actually what we needed to do was return to the sort of the gentle religion of this sort of pre-civilizational age when hunter-gatherers were lovely, lovely people because they worshipped the mother goddess and they didn't have
the compassionate baby-killing Moloch.
Well, you might very well say so, but I couldn't possibly comment. The connections between, Cinder, do you want to draw out that connection between
Moloch being representative of Saturn and Cybele being the female goddess of Saturn?
Let's work the other way. Let's work from the mother goddess to Moloch.
Let's actually go back to your point before I interrupted you.
Okay, which was what?
that we need to become more feminine in our approach to religion and go back to these hunter-gatherer societies that worshipped the mother goddess.
who were very gentle and they were very democratic and they were very egalitarian because they had a mother goddess. And that the father of the Trinity is probably the worst thing that I would assume Robert Graves would have a massive problem, not with Christianity specifically, but more generally with the masculine conception of God. But Christianity is probably the most opposite of Robert Graves because we do explicitly talk about Abba, Daddy, your father in heaven.
Now, would Graves would Graves take that view and apply it to the Olympians as well? As in, Zeus is kind of like the masculine slayer of the previous generation.
Yeah.
He would say that the Titans were the good guys.
Yeah, he sees if you go back prior to even to the Titans, there's I can't remember her name, but let me see if give me 1 second. I've got it right here. I'll just read the first line. This is from his book, The Greek Myths. And he sort of does something similar with the siege and the war and siege of Troy, whatever it's called. And this is the very first page. In the beginning, Eurynome, the goddess of all things, rose naked from chaos, but found nothing substantial for her feet to rest upon, and therefore divided the sea from the sky, dancing lonely upon its wave. Now then, this character, Ophion, a serpent, or this is now me paraphrasing, Ophion the spirit comes up and coils about her and couples with her, etc., and she that produces Earth, and then the Earth produces Uranus, and then Uranus produces Kronos, and Kronos produces Zeus. So Zeus is like fifth generation in this creation, and so Graves has gone back to even before Zeus and to say, like, look, the Greeks had this sort of somewhere in the deep past had this understanding of the mother goddess, but they got rid of it and they're violent because they don't have their mother goddess. I think that's more or less the connection that he would want to make.
Or that they don't remember and venerate their mother goddess.
Yeah, maybe you'd want to say that. So that I just want people to be aware.
But Robert Graves doesn't take issue with Zeus necessarily.
I don't know. I haven't read enough of it. I just know that I personally have a couple of sources by Robert Graves. I know Robert Graves' background, so I know the pinch of salt to take with it when I read it. And because I'm aware that people might do some extracurricular reading and will probably come in touch with Robert Graves if they do. I just want them to be aware of who Robert Graves was and what he thought.
So Robert Graves doesn't necessarily take issue with Zeus or the Christian Godhead specifically. What he does say is we need to take more account of the feminine divine.
I think that's a safe statement, yeah.
Which we see as the welcome mat to some pretty nefarious ideologies, or some pretty nefarious theologies.
Yeah.
Okay, the overview of Book 5 of the Iliad. In the Fagel translation, which is known as Diomedes Fights the Gods. The battle continues. Diomedes, inspired by Athena, goes on an absolute rampage. Pandaros, the archer who wounded Menelaus, who was influenced by Athena, wounds Diomedes. Diomedes prays to Athena, and she gives him an additional skills buff and the ability to see the gods in battle. Diomedes returns to the fight and kills many more Trojans, including sweet, sweet Pandaros. Diomedes encounters Aeneas, a Trojan, whose mother is Aphrodite. They fight, and Diomedes wounds him. Just as Diomedes is about to deliver the killing blow to Aeneas, Aphrodite whisks him away. Enraged by this fact, Diomedes strikes out with his spear, wounds Aphrodite on the wrist. Aphrodite flees to Olympus, complaining, I've been struck. She complains to Zeus, who's like, stay in your lane, love goddess. Why are you down here fighting with warriors when you are all about the secrets of marriage? Ares, disguised as a Thracian chieftain, spurs the Trojans onward. Hector and his Trojans try to push forward. The Greeks hold fast. As the battle progresses, The Greeks sense that Ares, or some other force, is among the Trojans and begin to fall back to their camp. Hera gives the Greeks more power, and Athena again fortifies Diomedes. Diomedes returns to combat and encounters Ares on the battlefield. They fight, and Diomedes drives his spear, which is guided by Athena's hand, into the gut of Ares. Ares, in terrible pain, roars and departs to Olympus. Ares complains to Zeus, and Zeus scolds him for being petty, warlike, and cruel. Athena and Hera return to Olympus in time and allow the men, Greek and Trojan, to fight without any gods present on the battlefield, which might be the first time we've seen this since we started reading this book. How was that reading, scale of 1 to 10?
9.9.
Don't lie
I'd
to
give the
me.
full 10. I'd give the full 10.
Yeah, I do like it a little bit better. I
So-
like it.
so-
It's better than the way you used to do it, which is a little bit more. Which was a
Fuck
little
you.
bit
That
more.
was
like,
that was exactly how I used to do it. Nothing
no,
has
no,
changed.
it wasn't. No, because you would do this sort of like, hello, dear listener. Let me take you back. We're at the walls.
That's
of
the part. That's the precious princess
you're-
approach.
No, it's the NPR. Like,
Oh,
we're now gonna go in Africa.
okay. You know that was the
Our
reading.
finest
So
and
so
display.
look, if you had been spending the last 80 hours editing your own voice, you would know where all your
I'm saying it's
problems
better.
were.
I'm
Okay,
saying it's
all right,
better.
all right. I'm offended by your encouragement. So, going into discussion 1, I feel like we're talking about fate too much. How can we approach fate differently? Like perhaps Diomedes, the slave king of fate. Is it an exercise of fate rebelling against fate?
Can you say it again?
Is Diomedes fighting the gods? Because he started this attack from his own spurring. Is the fact that he's now fighting, noticed by Athena, a product of fate, or is he fighting against fate?
Well, Athena's not the master of his fate. Athena herself sort of answers to fate. Where fate lies in all of this is a good question, which I think we could spend again hours and hours and hours on. But I'm not sure. I think I would argue that Athena's not God, right? She's not Jehovah. She is as much a slave to fate as anyone else, I think, because maybe Zeus isn't. I don't know what the theology of
Of convenience, that's what I'm calling this this Greek approach to celestial intervention is the theology of convenience. Isn't this where the term Deus ex machina came from?
I don't know.
God in the machine. What's the term?
Well,
the theatrical
the
term where
Yeah, Deus Ex Machina.
Deus
yeah,
Ex
where
Machina.
where the gods come down and rescue everything at the end, because that seems
It's
to be happening
the
quite a lot.
machinery of God.
Right.
The machinery of God. So like. Well, I mean, you know what a Deus Ex Machina. Do you want to explain what a Deus Ex Machina is, just in case?
From theatrical terms, as I understand it, it was a classical theatrical term where the gods would, at the end, lower themselves down and fix everything, as featured in Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream, when the gods lower themselves down at the end and fix everything that they fucked up in the beginning.
It's become a bit of a term to reference sort of laziness on behalf of the author. So it's like, well, I did a pretty good job for the first 80% of the book, and then oh yeah, this thing just happens and it solves the whole problem, and Deus Ex Machina.
I think one way to read this situation, though, as an alternative to Deus Ex Machina, is that Diomedes garners the favor of Athena. Athena has always garnered the favor of Zeus, and Zeus has always had the favor of fate. So there is this kind of great chain of being, or a great chain of fate. It's not so much about the gods just intervening and fixing everything. It's that because it's actually through personality, because Athena sees something in Diomedes, and Zeus from the moment that Athena was born, Zeus has seen something in Athena.
Yeah.
And so the way that I kind of read it is that there's fate, but fate is not simply this cold mechanical thing. It's something it takes it takes a certain personality to garner the favor of fate.
Well, fate is personified. There is fate. There's a god that represents fate who sort of like even Zeus is like a bit wary of.
I'm looking at this as the infighting amongst the gods as almost like there's an oligarchical power structure there that where they're continually fighting. There's a lot of they change their minds, and there's a lot of giving favor to one and then another if it suits them. It reminds me of something in a political movie or a political film, like a House of Cards type deal where they're subverting each other constantly, there's one-upmanship and competition amongst them all.
Athena shows up and whispers in everybody's ear. She even fucks with Ares.
Yeah, and that was my next point, is that Athena, having fucked with Pandaros first, who let fly the arrow that struck Menelaus, which destroyed the peace, which made the truce irrelevant. She whispered that into Pandaros' ear, and then she whispered into Diomedes' ear, go and fight. And then she whispers into Ares' ear, stop fighting, let's just let the men fight it out. And that's why Ares sort of leaves the field, and he's on the side of the Trojans. And then the killing starts with Diomedes having the skills buff, maybe known or unknown by the other gods, from Athena. And Diomedes begins cleaning up the field, doing some serious damage.
So I think it's very easy to look at this, what Athena's doing, and how Diomedes has these skills buffs, and to say that that's unfair. This is kind of unearned. Diomedes didn't earn, all of this ability to strike at the gods, and that Athena didn't earn her ability to kind of be so direct in the battlefield. On the other hand, the kind of the earnedness it's something that is innate. It's not something that's so we like in modern times. It's very easy to think of earning something as you kind of going through the trials and tribulations and then earning the thing through your task. But another way of earning something is simply through the way you are, through the way that you relate to others and relate to the world. So,
well, I'm not sure earned is the right word then for either of what we're talking about then. And I was going to say, like, I don't know that I see a difference between Diomedes getting this this epic gear. I confess, I when I read this, I was like, this does feel a little bit like RPG-ish, doesn't it? Like, oh, he's discovered this he's gotten this unlock. Or like Zelda, it's dangerous to go alone, take this. But there isn't really a difference between Athena showing up and going like, hey, here, have this, and someone like Achilles, who is the son of a god, and all the really great men in the Greek sort of pantheon are demigods, or certainly they've got some sort of divine aspect, not far down the line. And the one guy that really comes out of this to go on to actually like do anything is Aeneas, and he's the son of Aphrodite.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I take a kick at this. Like Diomedes gets favor from the gods, and they're all playing the game, and some of them get hit by the gods, and some of them are favored by them. But they're all playing the game. They're all participating and playing the game. And I don't know whether any of them earn anything or not. It's just kind of it's whatever favors them. But they're all playing in the game. They're playing with the gods, trying to play the gods' game. And the gods will endow on them some kind of weapon, or in the case of, level up, in order to do favor for them. And I think you have to, when you're in that position, when you're playing the game, you have to understand it, that it's easy come, easy go. You may be given this thing, but you may have it taken away from you just as quickly.
My point is also that it's very easy to look at Diomedes and say, oh, he didn't deserve to be given this power.
But he's playing the game.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but who cares? My attitude is, who cares? Like, who cares? Because who's sympathetic in this story? Who's sympathetic that you would actually say, like, well, actually, he does deserve the. I don't know who's actually like. I don't think. Like I said, I think the one guy I have sympathy for is Hector, but that doesn't mean I think he should get. I don't think he deserves powers.
Yeah, and I would say it's not just a game. I think this is what it means to have personality. That there is going to be favoritism. Zeus is going to have a favorite daughter, no matter how much you want to kind of bureaucratize it and take the emotion out of it. Zeus is going to have a favorite daughter, and it's going to be Athena. And Athena is going to favor certain men, no matter how much you want her to be fair and the representative of fairness and justice. She's going to favor certain men, and that's just how it is.
And she's the goddess of wisdom, so we consider in the West wisdom to be fairness, but in fact it's not. Wisdom looks at the most apt, the most talented, and the most likely to succeed and sides with them.
I'd also say that these gods seem to act a lot like human beings. They have a lot of the same reactions and the same characteristics and traits. They don't seem to me like they're held or hold themselves to a higher standard. They seem to talk like that. But really, when it comes down to it, they act as much like men than as anything else. Their behavior is...
Or maybe we as humans just don't understand what they're going through. Maybe they do have a higher standard, but we as humans couldn't possibly relate to that.
No, I think they have a lower standard. I think, like, when I look at this, I remember I can't help but think, like, wow, not only are they not like my god, they're not even like me. They're worse than me. Because I think, like, are the gods jealous of us because we die? Because our lives actually mean something?
Are they jealous of us because we eat and have blood?
Yeah.
Because these Greek gods don't eat or have blood.
Well, the jealousy, you have to say, cuts both ways too, because men are also jealous of the gods. And so it's kind of like how you brought up the two paradigms, right? The two paradigms couldn't possibly truly understand one another because they're coming from two completely different places.
But I think man understands that the gods, like, it is weird. Like, it's a mix of, like, those old 80s sitcoms. Like, every episode is year zero. There's no reference to previous episodes, right? The only event I can really think of like that in the Greek pantheon is for the Olympian gods is Hephaestus getting thrown off the mountain and getting crippled. All the others, it's a bit like nothing the gods do has any real implications for them. And that's what I mean by, I think they envy us. And I think there's a sort of understanding by man that we have a chance for greatness in a way that they don't. We have our 120 years, according to the Bible. And we've got that 120 years matter. Each day matters to us. Athena doesn't care like what day it is because she's as far away from her death as she was yesterday.
But she does care who wins the Trojan War.
But that's entertainment. This is her trying to entertain herself.
And I think to some extent that the gods, by their nature, already achieve greatness, but they achieve it intrinsically, and none of their actions really matter. So they're looking to live vicariously through to motivate great action. It's kind of like those parents who have kids in sports. Like, I want my kid to do really good in sports. Or these tiger moms who push their kids to achieve because they can live vicariously and pull a sense of pride. This is my son, in whom I am well pleased.
Let me tell you guys about tiger moms. There's actually a competitive aspect to it, which is that because actually prior to the current generation, Asian families typically have they have a lot of kids and very large extended families as well. And each generation will always compare how each family unit is doing compared to either their siblings or their cousins. And so that's like a huge motivating factor behind what it's all about, why they need to push their kids to do this, because you can't let your brother's kids be better than your kids.
It's funny you say that, and maybe we should. This will be the last thing I say on this, but that I went to a church service today for people who are leaving one phase of life and entering another phase of life. And the homily concluded on, what is it? Not, is it Walt Whitman, The Road Less Taken? And I think it's a shame for, I know lots of incredible Asian kids who are incredibly high achieving, who, I mean, the best thing they could do would be to take the road less taken. And I know my life is, I've had my ups and downs, and I maybe not would have always chosen it, but those downs, the path it's taken me on, my life's a lot more interesting. And actually, there's a value to it. And one of the best things you can do is look back and think like, yeah, that was shit, but it was kind of good for me to happen. And then, there's cheesy Facebook posts about like diamonds being made under pressure, but there's truth to it. And like, take the road less taken. If nothing else, you'll be a more interesting dinner guest. But yeah, Asian kids, don't be afraid to chase your dreams.
And you're right. A lot of Asian kids are pretty bad dinner guests.
Yeah. Asian kids deserve to be happy just like normal kids.
Play the game. I think in this, reading into this, is Diomedes is sticking his neck out, and a lot of other characters, and they're playing the game. They're looking to mix it up and get something done, and that's what I see. And they're going to be favored, and they're going to be persecuted for it. But their name is going to go down in history regardless.
Well, and I think that's where the frustration comes in, as Diomedes or Diomed. I keep hearing new pronunciations with all you guys, which is really super fun for me. But the frustration that Diomedes has when he corners Aeneas and comes after him, he wounds Aeneas, and he's like, this is it. He gets his horses, he passes him off to his guys, and as he's about to deliver the death blow, as his tiger mom trained him to do, Athena, Aphrodite swoops down and takes him away. And so frustrated is Diomedes that he strikes a god with his spear and wounds her wrist, which is, as far as I know to this point, the first time that a mortal has struck a god. And how I'm going to tie that into the show notes is Aphrodite has saved one of her pawns who was motivated by one of Athena's pawns. So this infighting against the gods, or amongst the gods, is now done via proxy warfare. So Athena is actually fighting Aphrodite here, but they don't do it on Mount Olympus, because the last time a war happened around Mount Olympus, it was the War of the Titans, when Zeus's father and his cadre were overthrown by the 12 gods who now occupy Olympus. That was their world war. That was their...
Yeah, they can't
the U.S. Using the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can't afford to do this anymore. So that was that. And now it's a Cold War. And so Troy has become the Cold War of Olympus.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but when I got to Diomedes, finally, I was really, I was happy for him. I was like, yeah, good, get her.
Well, I was frustrated. I was frustrated that Aphrodite was able to then return to Olympus, cry on her mother's lap, and then petition Zeus, like, look how it was treated
Daddy
down
bailed
there.
her out.
And I appreciated it.
Bailed her out.
Yeah. Well, but not only did he bail her out, but he did put her in her place and say, look, you're the goddess of love. Like, your lane is the secrets of marriage, or marriage secrets.
Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Perhaps also the meddling and wars of the gods.
The proxy wars.
Yeah. Perhaps also the meddling and war the gods take part in with men is an act of thinning the herd, thereby reducing the possibility that great men and sons of gods and goddesses will rebel against Olympus. So I don't know how much text there is for the Titans allowing Zeus and his cadre to play stuff out like this, but it seems like this is a more hands-on approach, like proxy warfare, After World War II, we had what? Vietnam, Korea, but it was all closely watched.
And there's very much like a calculus about like, well, the Russians are going to do that, and so we're going to be able to do this, but we're not going to be able to go all the way and do that. So there was very much this sort of like trying to figure out like understanding how far the envelope could be pushed.
Well, you could even look at it as like Russia and Vietnam, or excuse me, Russia in Afghanistan.
Oh yeah.
Like we're not going to put boots on the ground, but we're going to send Aphrodite and Ares and Athena down to fortify the Mujahideen in the guise of the CIA and weapons drops.
There's some fascinating stories that come out of Afghanistan in the 1980s, and some really, and importantly for this, some really, really weird alliances, some really weird cooperating sort of things. And like the Chinese. So there's this story about this SAS guy who's operating in Afghanistan, and they get the brand new like AK-74, and he gets given to him by the Mujahideen, and his job is to hike it over the mountains into Pakistan as fast as he can. And he hands it off to some CIA guy, and like it pings through several countries until it ends up in China. And the Chinese reverse engineer it. And the deal that communist China has is, well, okay, cool. Now we've got the technology for the AK-74. And sure, we'll supply the Mujahideen with enough AK-74, the AK-74 clones that they need. But it's like, wait, communist China is helping against communist Russia? How did that happen?
Well, China and Russia did have a falling out.
Right. Khrushchev and Mao did sort of get pissy with one another. And they're border wars. They're like low intensity border wars between China and Russia that like no one talks about.
Khrushchev and Mao still occupied Mount Olympus, as did the US and the European powers. So like you break it down to these world powers, they live on a different level. And these wars that they fight.
But there's also tiers, right? Because, I mean, so I'll be nice to the Americans out there. Let's say Reagan is Zeus and Gorbachev is Hera. And like there's this sort of uneasy sort of like marriage of superpowers who don't want to go to war. But then like, I don't know, who could, Thatcher could be like Ares. And don't worry, because when Zeus wants to, Zeus will piss and will fuck over Ares. Like when Reagan goes into Grenada and Ares is sitting there going, excuse me, what the fuck? Grenada's mine? Or at least they're big, for it nearly ruined the Atlantic relationship because Thatcher went, yeah, sure, Grenada needed to be invaded, but it is a Commonwealth country and the least you could do is let me know. And Reagan's response was, well, we don't know how infiltrated MI5 is with Russians, so no. So yeah, I mean, there's an interesting dynamic between the gods. They're not all equal, and nor are the smart god will know his place and know how to play his hand. I'm enjoying the sort of the metaphors, the allegory of the Iliad and Cold War politics too much.
Yeah, no, that was the overarching theme to me, or metaphor to me. I shouldn't say theme. So speaking of the allegories and metaphors for the Cold War, there's this concept around this period of a control society. And we talk about fate a lot, but no matter what you do, you are part of a society. But what kind of society are you a part of? And Jeff can speak to this in that Deleuze has this idea of a control society where it's not so much time, but it's the width and breadth of what you can access. So the Greeks and Trojans here are here to fight a war that they think they're free to fight, but they actually can't go that far beyond fighting this war because of these mechanisms of control.
Well, I think I can see that there are similarities and there are differences between what Deleuze is describing and what Greek society has described in classics.
Could you speak on that?
So what Deleuze is saying about societies of control is that these things become completely depersonalized, where you're assigned all of these different scores. You become the individual, and you get all of these numbers, and you earn scores that give you access to various tiers of society, right? Or access even to physical places. However, in the classical Greek society, I see it as rather than depersonalization, a hyper-personalization, where you're not given a score. You're not even entirely sure when the gods will favor you or when they won't. It's all based on personality. It's all based on how you act. Well, in that sense, how you act it's similar to Deleuze, but it's all based on who you are, how you relate. So where I would say classical society and the society of control that Deleuze describes are different is that in the classical Greek society, there is this very inward dimension, whereas in a technocratic society, it's all about what you do on the outside. So you can actually be extremely disingenuous and just try to game the system. You can earn social credit without actually expressing your inward personality. Whereas with the Greeks, because you're accountable to the gods, you're accountable in this hierarchy, you can't actually fake. Well, you can, but that generally won't actually help you if you try to fake your way to the top. It's all about your personality.
So it's about the value system of the elites that determines how much access you have.
Can you? I'm struggling with. I always struggle with the French guys. And I mean, can you explain it to me again? Like I'm 5.
Okay. So Deleuze gets the concept from who's the other French guy? Foucault. And so Foucault describes this kind of transition in history from societies of sovereignty to societies of discipline. So in societies of sovereignty, we had something that, very much the feudal system, where those in control governed who lived and who died. But other than that, they tended to refrain from micromanaging the people. Right? You just
Yeah.
had they set the rules and you follow the rules or you die. When we transitioned to societies of discipline, it tended to become much more regulation of space and time. So you have to be at the factory at 9 a.m. in this place. And then at 12, you go to the lunchroom. And then after that, you be at this place.
They care less about like how hard you're working and more that you're just there.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the previous societies like, I don't care how long it took you to harvest this wheat. You gave me your wheat, fine.
Yeah. And then as we transitioned out of societies of discipline, Deleuze says that we went into something called societies of control, which is that societies of control, they still to some degree cared about where you were and at what time, but they also began assigning all these different scores to people. And so they kind of gamified the whole system where the way that they got you to comply was because you had to earn all of these scores in order to get access to possible futures. They didn't really need to tell you, oh, you can't be here at this time. That's already been determined in all of these little scores that you earn. That's been in the process of being determined for you ever since the moment you were assigned social insurance number or GPA, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's controlling you without you needing to even show up.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, it's determined for you to show up.
I mean, it's like they do give you the option, but then not really, right? It's like, oh, you don't have to go to university, but then you kind of do depending on which future you're looking for.
I get the transition from the first one to the second one. I'm still having a little bit of a trying to wrap my head around the second to the third.
Well, the second to the third is that everything has to be approached from how the first one or the second one is approached holistically. So you have to partake in this discipline to approach everything. So every part of your life, what you look at the internet, how you pay bills, how you go to the store and what you buy has to be approached via the state approved or the authoritative approved approach.
Whereas the second one is just work. Or
second one is just worked. Right.
Show up, be where you are at the right time.
So the second one is 8 hours a day. The third one is 24 hours a day.
Yeah, yeah. It's a scale of micromanagement.
And you have to approach every facet of that 24 hours a day via the prescribed way to approach it, or you get docked points.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like 1984.
Yeah. It's technocracy.
And so I can see that you could draw certain parallels between the society of control and the Greeks, but there's also things that are very, very polar opposite as well.
Well, but it's all determined via omnipotent, pseudo omnipresent, immune to the consequences of their own ideology central bureau.
Yeah.
So whether it's Geneva or Olympus is at what we're talking about beside the point.
They are watching your every move, but at the same time, it's not quite as mechanical. It's the opposite of mechanical. It's very much
It's been
personal.
drilled
It's emotional.
It's been internalized.
It's organic. That's what I'll say in its defense. It's organic.
But it's been internalized. Whereas the second one, the control's external. The third one, you're sort of controlling yourself for them by the process of the internalization of it.
The only thing I'd mention is, I'd ask, is it that fortune favors the bold in regards to the gods?
Not necessarily, but sometimes.
Well, I mean, I think that plays out with Athena. Athena's the one who's prepared to do what she wants. But then you could say, like, well, is that Athena being bold, or is that Athena knowing that she's Zeus's daddy's little girl?
Yeah.
Well, and I think it absolutely is, because I think there were a lot of bold warriors that took the field, like Odios and Phaistos and Phereclos, who all bid it in some pretty major ways. I mean, Odios had a spear fixed between his shoulders that was driven through the chest and beyond it, which from a very human point of view means he had catastrophic damage to his internal organs. He probably punctured a lung, and there's an outside chance he had a spinal column separated by a foreign object. But he was brave. I mean, he was brave. He took the field. He didn't deny. He rode with his captain.
So sorry. I mean, I might be being difficult on this, but so how are we the society of society of control? How are we relating that to this?
I got it. Here's a question that I would pose to you guys to kind of illustrate what's going on here. And this is something that comes up from time to time in reactionary circles as well. It's like, which do you prefer? A system of governance that claims to be objective and has checks and balances and says, oh, we don't want to insert our personality into this. We want rule of law and to kind of check against those emotional things. Or is China more honest about it when they say, well, our decisions come from our party leaders? And that's the truth, right? They do try to obscure it in some sense, but then at the same time, everybody kind of knows what's going on. So I pose the question to you guys, is it just better that the Greeks are at least honest about it? That Zeus is in charge and that he plays favorites? Or do we want to get into this attempt, and quite often futile attempt, at obscuring that and saying, oh no, the gods play by these rules. They have the Olympian constitution, and they can't break that unless 5 out of 9 Supreme Court justices vote the other way.
So I think it's somewhere in between. I hate to be that guy, because I think it's something like, the Olympian Constitution works when it's Olympians, the Olympians want Olympian rule of law. But, should some fucking human show up and start going, I never elected Zeus. It's like I think the British are more honest about the Constitution than the Americans are, which is to say that the Constitution is not this document, but this sort of like as much the tradition of the country as anything else. And in the sense, the Olympians have a constitution, and the guy who shows up and tries to fuck with that because he doesn't care about the tradition, the constitution doesn't work then. And so I'm at this point where it's like, well, if the Chinese were going through what we were going through, I don't know how much they would really be able to keep it all going. But I think that sort of, again, I hate to say it, it's a little bit of a platitude, but like to an extent, our values have been our destruction.
Well, our values
are good.
Our values as kept by Mount Olympus have become our destruction. So we put these people in charge to keep our values, thinking they won't bend them to enrich themselves or put forth their heroes and grant them boons and attribute buffs. It was naive.
This is a great moment to have a little sampler of the Laurentian Home Companion, because Laurentian and I have been having a conversation about, of all things, the Canadian Milk Board. And this plays out, like what we're talking about here plays out with the Canadian Milk Board. And I won't go too deep into it, but the model of the Canadian Milk Board seems to work when everyone's like an honest broker in it, an honest actor. And you have to have a certain amount of social trust and capital to make it work. But then all of a sudden, some snakes, Dutch people, enter the garden and mess it all up. Do you want to? It might be interesting to hear Laurentian talk about it through the prism of the Canadian Milk Board.
I don't know if I'll go there just yet. It's a long, complicated story. I think for another time for sure. But I'll touch a little bit on human rights. Would that work? Because we have the Charter of Human Rights in Canada, which is, if there's anything crazy about any kind of constitutional law, it's a Charter of Human Rights. So in my mind, the way I see it is that you've got these atomized individuals who all feel that they're empowered, who they are gods, who they feel that they have their individual rights supersede everything over their power. And that's just not the reality. That's just not the case. And whether it's a constitution, charter of rights, unwritten constitution, whatever it is, you're giving these people a false idea of power and strength. I don't know I can't speak very much to the Chinese model, but it seems to me that the people know their place and they don't have any power. The party has the power. Right or wrong, they know, they have a formal idea of what's going on and what's happening. That doesn't lend the gods or the party officials or in Canada, your Laurentian elite to actually do anything worthwhile. But maybe they're honest about how terrible they are. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it seems in this time that everyone thinks that they're gods due to these unofficial charters, and working with liberal worldviews and atomization of individuals, they try to be gods themselves when they fail miserably at it.
I think there's something to be said about transparency too. All of the Olympian gods know where to appeal when there's an issue. They know to go directly to Zeus. Whereas in our system, it's like, oh no, you got to write an omnibus bill, and then you got to go through the lower house and the upper house, and it totally obscures how most laws are generally made, which is through the lobbying system, through think tanks, NGOs. Well, all this stuff is discussed long before things get to the omnibus bill.
Right. It's the atomization of individuals, and then they look for a group. Eventually the conclusion of that is to look for power. They try and group together whatever kind of skin color or personal beliefs they have or ideologies in order to pool their power together, which results in absolute anarchy, where we're at today.
In the pursuit of order, we get anarchy.
Yeah. And it's not as if the god who sits at the top of the pantheon is unaccountable, because there was a story of Zeus's father, Cronus, who was held accountable, right? But it takes an effort to hold that head of the pantheon to account.
Well, and they held that head of the pantheon to account because Cronus was eating his own children, and Zeus escaped that, usurped that power because of its unfairness and barbarity, took power, and then became frivolous, subjective, and unfair himself.
And you could say the kind of end of the Olympians was never written by the Greeks, but you could say that, is Zeus still powerful today in Greece? So you could say he ultimately met his end.
Wow. There's a resurgence of Olympian god worship in the last two decades.
So I guess what I'm getting at is that it's kind of a fact of life that there will be good regimes and bad regimes. One thing that I think seems to be the case is that there definitely are no eternal regimes.
So it seems to me like what I'm trying to say, the word I've been looking for, or the phrase I've been looking for, is good faith actors. And it's evident to me that more important than whatever sort of constitutional system you have, you need good faith actors. And bad faith actors in the best constitutional system, despite what the Americans, founding father, Mason, Satanists thought they could achieve by overthrowing their anointed king. Whatever they thought they could achieve by like making a system that there's some phrase about like we want a system so that even the worst can operate in it, something like that. I'm sure someone will know what I'm talking about. No, sorry, you do need a good civic culture for everything to operate properly, and that means good faith actors. And you could be in the most, lawless area, and if you've got like good faith actors, that area is going to function well, and you could have the most top down, authoritarian, police on every corner. But if everyone's a bad faith actor, you're gonna have a miserable time. So that's what, yeah.
And to that point, it's even gotten to now where supposedly policing morality is bad, especially in American culture. Oh, don't be a Puritan, right? Don't be a 1990s soccer mom who wants to ban video games. It's like we don't do that here, right? In Wakanda, we don't do that here.
Yeah.
Don't be on time. Don't hold people to a standard that you hold yourself to.
Yeah.
I think, and does playing Grand Theft Auto like encourage school shootings? Yeah, probably not. Probably not. But there's something spiritually unhealthy about the guy whose idea of like after sitting in front of an Excel spreadsheet, he just wants to go and kill some hookers in Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
well, and my brother and I get a very few amount. Our schedules overlap for a very minuscule amount of time, and when it does, we sit together on a couch playing Xbox while the other person works on something on a laptop. And we have been playing Grand Theft Auto 5 recently, and we both recently come to the conclusion that there's something very wrong with this game. In what we're doing, what we're asked to do, what we're asked to justify, of murdering a lot of people for money. And the moral impetus that justifies it is very weak. And we've realized that as we've gotten older, it has gotten very much weaker to the point that we can't play the game anymore because whoever's releasing this game is fucked morally.
it's the same trajectory movies have taken. So in the 80s, video games and movies, and in the 90s, video games and movies, you knew who the good guy was. You knew who the bad guy was. Who was the bad guy? Well, he was the guy that, wore dark clothing and stole the princess and these really simple tropes. And I think that we have this idea that like simple tropes are somehow not sophisticated, which I think the more I think about it, couldn't be further from the truth, because these simple time-honored archetypes, the reason they're there is because they are depthless in the material that they can provide. And there's something about, everything, if it's going to be a good movie, according to the Academy Awards, or if it's going to be a good, whatever, there's got to be a lot of ambiguity about it. And I see that with what you're talking about, that like there's a lot of ambiguity in Grand Theft Auto. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Well, everyone.
Yeah, in Grand Theft Auto 5, everyone is the bad guy.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because if you can kill someone who's worse than you, then you're the good guy. But you've built your good guy status on a mountain of bodies.
This came up in a chat that we're a part of today. And someone suggested essentially that being in a loose confederation in order to fight evil essentially made you good. Well, I didn't want to stir shit up any more than it was, but I don't think that's right. Because evil can fight evil, right? Milton in Paradise Lost, when the fallen angels hit rock bottom, it's pandemonium. And when you say pandemonium, you mean everything is going wrong. And the demons, and when they hit, and the fallen angels, they don't immediately get together and work to fight against God. They're fighting each other. So evil can easily fight evil. And just resisting evil doesn't mean you're good. And you can look at the, 1942, right? Evil against evil. When the Germans invade Russia, Hitler and Stalin, just because Hitler fights Stalin or Stalin fights Hitler doesn't make either of them good. They're both bad guys.
Unless you're a liberal historian.
Or you're a national socialist. And
Yeah, well,
what's the difference these days? Am I right? Am I right? So evil can fight evil. And Stalin fighting Hitler or Hitler fighting Stalin didn't make them good. Being good is something else. It's not just not being evil. And yeah, I can't remember why I said that, but it was very important that I get that out. But yeah, being good is more than just not being evil or fighting evil. Evil can fight with evil. Oh, Grand Theft Auto 5, that like everyone's bad in it. So who cares? I can't watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia anymore. I used to love that show. And what was so funny about it was that you didn't care about what happened to any of the characters. Like because you wanted to see them crash and burn because they're all sort of despicable people. And that's funny when you're like a young guy who's, a little bit cynical. But as I've sort of turned this point in the last, I would say 2 or 3 years, where I've really hungered for something more significant in my life, just watching assholes crash and burn isn't funny to me. And it's easy. It's really easy to create nasty humor. And I think about things like Dad's Army, which is a British comedy show. And they're all a bit silly, but there isn't a nasty thing in that show. And it's a piece of comedy genius compared to anything that's out these days. And I just want something more now. It's not enough just to be funny or not be bad.
I just say, like, I think GTA 5 is a represent. I've never played it, but I assume it's a representation of human nature to some extent, where we all have that evil in us and can do evil things, very powerful evil things. However, there's another side to it in that people can do good things. People can be evil, but they can also do good things and morally just things. And they can do those things 60-40% of the time, and then eventually 70-30% of the time. And some part of popular culture to some extent is the understanding of you can be a bad person, but there's somebody there maybe who will forgive you, and you don't have to continue that. You don't have to believe that you're a bad person all the time, and that you can be forgiven and do good things with being honest to yourself at the same time.
Okay, so really quick, I'll tell you that there are characters that will give you, and there are character forces that will justify the shitty decisions that you make, but you're still being justified on the wrong decisions that you make. There is no option to do the right thing. Even the forces of what we consider the forces of good, like the government, law enforcement, they never show up. And the only aspects of government law enforcement that show up are already corrupt. And at the end of the game, you end up killing a guy that represents that. And that is represented as the moral decision.
It's an incomplete picture, GTA 5. I'll try and, this is a stretch, and feel free to edit it out, but the television show about bad men that I continually refer back to is True Detective, where you've got two police officers who've had sordid lives going to prosecute or build a case against a family who's involved with child trafficking. For generational child trafficking, and the occult is played heavily into that television show as well. But they do terrible things, but they also there's an arc of good things that they do, and the conclusion at the end is ambiguous at best, but there does seem to be some kind of redemption for both the characters in the end. Whereas GTA 5, as you've explained, and from what I understand, is just an incomplete story. that there's no actual reality to it, that it's promoting a complete degeneracy.
Yep. The end of the story is when you kill the more corrupt guy than you are. You murder him with the help of your two friends by locking him in a car trunk and pushing the car over a cliff into the water where he presumably drowns. And then you're greeted with a credit screen with a beautiful sunset. You've just done a murder.
So,
and you're vindicated via aesthetics.
yeah. So I'm reminded in all this that, it's an unfair representation of the human condition to say that everything's just fine. But it's an equally unfair representation of the human condition to say that we're all just terrible. Because and whenever I think about good triumphing in the face of evil, there's always one guy I think of in particular, and I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but his name was Father Maximilian Kolbe. He's now a saint. He was a Roman Catholic priest who, in the Holocaust, he got thrown into Auschwitz or something. And he put himself, they were going to take someone off to the gas chambers or something, or execute someone, and he put himself in that man's place, and the guy survived. And because of Maximilian's sacrifice, there's now today alive like 40 descendants of the guy who he saved. And it's best summed up in Solzhenitsyn's quote, which is that the line between good and evil runs through the mind of every man, or something like that. Everyone has the potential to do good. Everyone has the potential to do evil.
Yeah, and that's a better, more well-rounded story than just complete degeneracy repeating itself over and over again. But the question I have then, would GTA 5 be the highest seller if there was, maybe they'd sell more if there was some ambiguity or some questions on morality in their video game. I don't know, but maybe that's a more well-rounded version.
It's easier to walk down the mountain than it is to walk up it. It's more satisfying in the short term to feed your base desires of rape and pillage via PlayStation in GTA 5 than it is to look up and take the next step up the mountain.
Well, and I would say that to both of y'all's point, and I use y'all very sparingly, is that GTA 5 did not offer the upward path.
No.
Even as a replay option, could you play this as an upstanding citizen just to see how hard it would be? Because playing this game asked me to murder innocent people to get out of the decrepit state that I was in.
And okay, they're computer simulations, but it feels a little bit like conditioning to me.
Mm-hmm, yeah. It's very easy to be surrounded by this media and then just kind of allowing that to affect your view of the world, become very cynical.
Next week, Canon Fodder will be looking at Red Dead Redemption 2.
Same story. Same story.
I thought Red Dead Redemption was I thought that was a bit more, he was a bit more of a good guy.
You still had to rob people. You still had to do crime. Like, you couldn't dig ditches for 6 months to earn enough money to buy a new pair of pants to wear to the job interview at the bank where you wouldn't rob it. I'm not saying that would be most glamorous, but from a game designer point of view, wouldn't it be interesting if you offered the straight and narrow as an option? Because it's all about options. It's open world. It's all these things. So, do whatever you want to do, except the right thing.
I'm going to take this opportunity to tell the Canonites of our first Canon Fodder approved video game. It's Farming Simulator 19. So go and check that out. There's no killing or stealing. I haven't played it, but I was just trying to think of what video game there is out there that's like benign.
Go ahead, Laurentian. You wanted to take us on a new tack.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about violence and how our culture. I was reading the Machiavellians. I've been pushing through it here as we're reading lots of other stuff. But one of the chapters was on Sorel and his discussion on the use of violence and how our society has become this paragon of peace where we no longer choose violence, but we accept corruption and degeneracy very easily. Our tastes for violence have subsided, which leaves us on this great moral high ground. But the corruption still continues and continually gets worse. And violence is not, in any respect, is not an answer to a law-abiding citizen. And that's something I found very interesting because I don't not believe in violence as an answer. I'm not advocating it for anybody. I'm not saying that it's an answer, but there is something to that statement where the only thing, and I think we see it in book 5, is it's incredibly action oriented. And I'd also bring in the fact that maybe Troy was corrupt beyond violence. They were the peaceful, they didn't believe in violence. They stayed behind their walls and they wouldn't go and invade anybody else. But Paris goes out and steals someone's wife, or Priam attempts to have his son killed. And look at the results of those kinds of corruption. Violence comes to their front door regardless.
Can I just say quick
Priam knows.
Yeah, I would say as a armchair historian to this, Priam knew, he always knew, as soon as Paris came back with Helen, he knew, and he sent a diplomatic envoy to try and smooth things over. He never once chastised his son to return the stolen wife of a rival kingdom. He never once said, "You're wrong." He never once put him out of the house. He still has a luxurious bedroom in Priam's house.
And he has every hint. He's gotten every hint from, the gods and fate and Cassandra that this is going to be what destroys his city. He has more than enough information to know that this is going to be what destroys his city.
Not only this, his choice guaranteed that his grandson, Hector's son, would have his skull dashed against the walls of Troy by invading Greeks because he let his son get his dick wet and did not call him out for fornication, for adultery. Would have been easy to do. Could have nipped it in the bud right away. Priam had dozens of sons.
Instead, we get book 5 with a mass act of violence, which could have been subsided by some control or some smaller acts of violence.
Some fatherhood.
Some fatherhood. Maybe we've, a good spanking of Paris's ass would have saved thousands of lives. Instead, now we've got, we're patronizing these gods and we're patronizing these, supposed leaders in order to facilitate a global war at this time. That was the First World War.
How about raising a son who would rather choose the most beautiful woman on earth than kind of taking responsibility and ruling over all of Asia Minor, or all the wisdom to secure victory in battles? Instead, he just wants the most beautiful woman in the world.
And that for him was probably a self-validation. Like, I'm good enough to have the most beautiful woman in the world.
But he also makes the choice that I expect him to. When I know the background of Paris and that he hasn't been raised by his father, he makes the right choice in a way. He can't handle the responsibility of Asia. And what would he do with wisdom? But the most beautiful woman in the world in his bed? That makes a lot of sense to me for this.
To someone who grew up without a dad, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
He did what Achilles didn't do. It's almost like he accepted his fate at that point. Like, he followed through on what the original point of this story was that he's true to himself. He's a corrupt weasel, and he knew it all along.
Was there another section that we had?
No. So what we're going to do now is 2.5 hours of Cinder reading about grievous bodily harm. So I have the charts here. The diaphragm. No. I think we should do our conclusions now. And I want Laurentian to go first because this is a Laurentian sparse episode, which makes me sad.
Well, in conclusion, we get to see what everybody's there for. It's the show. It's the Steven Seagal Under Siege moment where all the technologies of the gods is brought forward, all their power, all their manipulating is brought forward to all their technology of both weaponry and medicine is brought forward to this moment. And there has been other moments, there will be other moments in the future, but this seems to be the all out, the battle scene. And we're getting a lot from that, from this episode, in that we're understanding now the power dynamics that these gods have, and they behave, how they behave and how poorly they behave. And they're no better, they're not held to a higher standard other than their own self-confidence and belief. But they do allow mortals to play the game with them, to at least participate and earn some glory in their violence. And to my last point, all of this could have been subsided if there was some discipline in Troy, if there was some lack of corruption other than relying on the gods who are corrupt.
Well, and you could even say that Zeus also failed as a father with Aphrodite because he didn't teach her not to lie to someone or offer them boons or stats buffs in exchange for something she didn't earn.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, is that everybody's behaving poorly in corruption, and violence is the only answer for all of these people, gods and humans alike. And massive amounts of violence and resource expenditure in order for them to right their corruption. It's a great purge of bad ideas and purge of bad behavior.
I really like that last point that Laurentian made, that quite often fate is out of our own hands because it's also in the hands of our fathers and those who came before us. And so it gets to the point where through the degeneration over generations, you get to a point where you just seem to be tied in this pandemonium, right? And way out of that is violence quite often. You may say that that's unfortunate, but fate has led us to a certain path.
Well, for me, at the end of this chapter, I have a lot of sympathy for Diomedes. If you take the gods to be personification of forces, we talked a few episodes back about the welder who does everything right, and then he gets fired because, oh, well, the economy, this sort of thing is the equivalent of like an Olympian god. And all of a sudden his life is caught up because. And, how many guys in middle America or northern England or Midwest Canada wouldn't want to take a sword to the economy or take a sword to Aphrodite, who started this? And it's a shame. It might have been useful to talk about Zeus and Ares, but I think what Zeus says to Ares, he could say to all the gods on behalf of all of us, and which is essentially, you are disappointments to us. You're supposed to be gods, and look at what you're doing with it. You're having us dance for you. And I think that goes for the people who are leading us.
So I would address the section of this episode I was not able to dip into, which is there are many brave men who rose to meet fate in this story that just became fodder to die on Diomedes' spearhead. They had very real deaths. They were thrust through the gut, they were thrust through the face, they were thrust through the torso. That's grievous bodily harm, that's pulmonary overload, that's collapsed lungs, that's massive trauma to the esophagus, internal organ ruptures, intestinal wall lining, lacerations. These are, even though we consider this to be a fictional story, these are real men with real bodies who are dying for the glory of those chosen by the gods. And to GTA 5, you kill people every day, and you assume that most of them die right away. But there's a very real chance that when reality is applied to something like GTA 5, you may have shot someone in passing in the stomach who took 3 days to die under the vigil of his family, just so you could get a cool new car. And this is an approach that the Olympians, and by proximity and metaphor or analogy, our elites take to this society. So are we choosing the fates that are offered to us, or are we choosing the right way? From all of us at Canon Fodder, we'd like to thank you for being here today. We'd like to thank our sponsor, IronAgeArchive.com, and we hope you join us next time. Like us on Facebook and join us on MySpace.
Hey, you made it to the end. Good for you. The Iron Age Archive Project is excited to offer NFTs on OpenSea, the world's largest NFT marketplace. Each unique set is specific to an episode and one of a kind. Own a piece of Iron Age history. I mean, not literally, though you do own it, just not from the historical period. It's a figurative Iron Age, but you will own it literally. But you do know that it's digital, right? Oh, this is bad copy. But it's too late to change it now. Exclusive Iron Age Archive NFTs now on OpenSea. Outbid your friends, outbid your family, outbid your mortal enemies with Iron Age Archive NFTs. Links in the description.